Normandy, France. July 18th, 1944. Oberleutnant Klaus Becker crouched behind the scorched hull of what had been an American M4 Sherman tank. Its olive-drab paint bubbling in patches where fire had licked the metal. The morning fog still clung to the hedgerows of the Bocage country, turning the Norman countryside into a maze of gray-green shadows. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like approaching thunder. But here, in this cratered field outside the village of Saint-Lô, an eerie quiet had settled over the wreckage of yesterday's battle. Becker wasn't a tanker. He was an engineer, part of the Waffenprüfamt 6, the German Army Weapons Agency's tank division. For 3 years, he'd studied Soviet T-34s pulled from the Eastern Front, analyzed every captured British Cromwell and Churchill they could get their hands on. But this Sherman was different. This one was nearly intact. Herr Oberleutnant, called Feldwebel Roth, wiping grease from his hands onto his already filthy uniform. The turret mechanism is still functional. So is the transmission. Whatever hit this beast, it wasn't catastrophic. Becker climbed onto the Sherman's deck, his boots finding purchase on the ridged steel. The hatch gaped open like a wound. Inside, the crew compartment told its story in rust-brown stains and the acrid smell of burnt rubber and cordite. The Americans had abandoned it or been forced out when a German 75mm round had punched through the side armor, killing the loader instantly and setting the interior ablaze. But the fire had gone out quickly. The crew had engaged the fire suppression system before fleeing. Smart, Becker muttered to himself, running his hand along the interior. Very smart. He'd seen inside German Panzers after they'd been hit. The difference was stark. When a Panther or Tiger caught fire, it became an inferno. The ammunition stored vertically along the hull walls would cook off in a cascade of explosions that could blow the turret clean off. German crews called their tanks Tommy cookers, in grim acknowledgement of how easily they became death traps. But this Sherman, the ammunition was stored in armored boxes below the turret basket, each with its own water jacket for the fire suppression system. They designed this thing to survive being hit, Roth observed, joining him inside the cramped interior. Not survive, Becker corrected, playing his flashlight across the control panel. They designed it to burn out quickly and leave the tank salvageable. Look at this. He pointed to the engine compartment bulkhead. Unlike German tanks, which integrated the engine and crew spaces with minimal fire barriers, the Sherman had a solid wall of steel between the men and the massive radial engine behind them. Even the fuel tanks weren't in the crew compartment, they were outside, in sponsons protected by additional armor. Over the next 6 hours, Becker and his team documented everything. They measured armor thickness only 76 mm on the front hull, pathetically thin by German standards. They examined the suspension, the tracks, the gun mount. They photographed the engine, a massive Continental R975 radial aircraft engine, the same type that powered some American bombers, modified for tank use. It was when Roth started counting components that something shifted in Becker's mind. Herr Oberleutnant, there are only 5 main assemblies in this gearbox, Feldwebel reported, his voice carrying a note of confusion. 5. The transmission in my Panther had 17 major components. It's almost primitive. Becker knelt beside him, staring at the simple, robust mechanism. The Sherman's transmission wasn't an engineering marvel. It was mass-produced automotive technology, barely modified from truck designs. The final drives were simple planetary gears. The suspension used vertical volute springs technology the Americans had been using since the 1930s. Nothing innovative, nothing clever, nothing difficult to manufacture. He stood up suddenly, his head ringing against the turret roof. Scheisse, he breathed. Roth, how many Panthers can Daimler-Benz produce in a month? Perhaps 40, Herr Oberleutnant, on a good month. And Tigers? Fewer, maybe 25 from Henschel's plant. Becker climbed out of the Sherman and looked across the battlefield. In the morning light, he could count 6 more wrecked Shermans within view. 6 in one field, from a one engagement. He'd read the intelligence reports that morning before setting out. American losses in Normandy were staggering. The Shermans died in droves against German armor, sometimes losing 5 or 6 tanks to knock out a single Panther. But the Americans kept coming. "What are you thinking, Herr Oberleutnant?" Roth asked, climbing out after him. Becker didn't answer immediately. He was calculating. If the Americans were losing tanks at this rate, and still attacking with seemingly unlimited numbers, if their crews could abandon damaged vehicles and receive new ones within days, if their supply lines could deliver these machines faster than German guns could destroy them. "I'm thinking," he finally said, his voice hollow, "that we're fighting the wrong war." Weapons Testing Facility, Kummersdorf, July 25, 1944. The captured Sherman sat under harsh electric lights in Bay 3 of the testing facility, 50 kilometers south of Berlin. Becker stood before an audience of 15 men engineers from Krupp, Henschel, and Daimler-Benz, alongside officers from the Heereswaffenamt and 2 representatives from Albert Speer's Armaments Ministry. Each held a copy of his preliminary report, 47 pages of measurements, photographs, and analysis. Oberst Friedrich Müller, the facility's commanding officer, opened the session. "Gentlemen, Oberleutnant Becker has spent the last week examining this American tank. His findings are concerning. Becker, proceed." Becker clicked on the overhead projector, throwing a schematic onto the wall. "The M4 Sherman is, by every metric we value, an inferior tank. Its armor is inadequate. Our 75 mm KWK-42 can penetrate it at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. Its 75 mm M3 gun cannot penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any practical combat range. Its ground pressure is poor, its speed modest, its crew comfort minimal." He paused, letting the murmurs of satisfaction ripple through the room. These men had built the Panther, the Tiger, the King Tiger. They had created the most powerful tanks in the world. And yet, Becker continued, advancing the slide, "The Americans are producing them at a rate of 2,000 per month." Murmurs died. 2,000, he repeated. "From multiple factories. Detroit, Chicago, Fisher Body and Grand Blanc. Michigan, a facility that was building Buick automobiles 18 months ago and is now producing 400 Shermans monthly. The Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio converted from building train engines to building Shermans in less than a year." He walked to the Sherman itself, slapping its hull. "This tank is not a weapon. It is a product. Every component is designed for mass production. The hull is a single casting, no welding required beyond attaching the final drive housings and deck plates. The turret is also cast. 1 pour, 1 mold, minimal machining." Rolf Dietrich, the chief engineer from Henschel, spoke up. "Castings are weaker than proper welded armor. They're doing it because they lack skilled labor." "Exactly," Becker agreed. "They lack skilled labor, so they designed a tank that doesn't require it. The Continental engine is produced by the tens of thousands for aircraft. The transmission is so simple that any automotive factory can build it. The tracks are rubber-bushed steel. They wear out faster than our manganese steel tracks. but they can be replaced in 30 minutes by a crew with hand tools. He pulled out a stack of photographs. Gentlemen, I documented the Sherman's construction. I've counted every bolt, every weld, every component. A Sherman requires approximately 9,000 man-hours to build from raw materials to finished tank. How many does a Panther require? The Krupp representative shifted uncomfortably. Approximately 55,000 man-hours, but 55,000. Becker interrupted. A ratio of 6 to 1. They can build 6 Shermans in the time it takes us to build 1 Panther. But the ratio is actually worse than that, because those 6 Shermans can be built simultaneously in 6 different factories using non-specialized labor, while our Panthers require precision machining, skilled welders, and components from suppliers that are now being bombed by American B-17s. He advanced to the next slide, a comparison chart he'd stayed up 3 nights completing. The Sherman's final drive uses commercial truck bearings, available anywhere. The Panther's final drive requires custom-manufactured bearings to handle the torque of its 700-horsepower Maybach engine. Those bearings are made at exactly 3 facilities in the Reich, all of which are priority targets for Allied bombing. Oberst Muller stood. Becker, you're telling us their advantage is industrial. I'm telling you their advantage is systemic. Herr Oberst, look at this. He pulled a maintenance manual from his satchel, a captured American document, translated into German by intelligence officers. This is the Sherman's field maintenance manual. 70 pages, pictures on every page, written for conscripts with an 8th grade education. It tells crews how to diagnose problems, what they can fix themselves, what requires a maintenance depot. He dropped it on the table and pulled out another document much thicker. This is the Panther's maintenance manual, 450 pages. Written for trained mechanics, it assumes knowledge of advanced hydraulics, complex transmissions, specialized tools. And here's what it doesn't tell you. Field repair on a Panther requires components that must be rail-shipped from Germany. A Sherman crew can cannibalize parts from another wrecked Sherman and be operational in hours. Becker walked to a corkboard he'd prepared, where he'd pinned intelligence photographs from Normandy. In the week after D-Day, we knocked out 147 Shermans in the British sector alone. Intelligence celebrated it as a great victory, but I've reviewed the follow-up reports. By July 1st, less than 4 weeks later, the British had more operational Shermans than they'd started with. They weren't repairing them all. They were replacing them faster than we could destroy them. The room had gone completely quiet. Gentlemen, we are fighting a tank that is designed to die. The Americans accept that their Shermans are inferior. They've planned for it. Every Sherman is built with the expectation that it will be destroyed or abandoned. But it doesn't matter, because there are 10 more behind it, and 10 more behind those. And they can all be crewed, fueled, armed, and sent into battle faster than our Tigers can traverse their turrets. Dietrich from Henschel stood angrily. So what do you propose, that we copy their crude methods, build inferior machines? No, Becker said quietly. I propose that we recognize we've already lost the production war. A Panther is worth 6 Shermans in combat, but the Americans have 60 Shermans. A Tiger can destroy 10 Shermans before being knocked out, but they have 100 Shermans, and when those 10 Tigers break down, which they will, because Tigers break down constantly, there are no replacements coming. He looked at Muller. Herr Oberst, we've built the finest tanks in the world. We've built them with such precision, such complexity, such engineering excellence, that only Germany could produce them. And that, gentlemen, is exactly the problem. Only Germany can produce them. But any industrialized nation can produce a Sherman. Eastern Front. Vistula River, August 12, 1944. Hauptmann Ernst Vogel stood in the turret of his Panther Aus FG, watching the sunset paint the Polish countryside in shades of amber and blood. His tank, designated number 231, was one of 12 Panthers in the 2nd Company. And at this moment, only 5 of them were operational. Not because of combat, because of breakdowns. 3 weeks earlier, Vogel had read Becker's report. It had been circulated through armored divisions as a classified document, meant to inform commanders about enemy capabilities. Most of his fellow officers had dismissed it as defeatist nonsense. But Vogel couldn't stop thinking about those numbers. 6-to-1, production ratios, replacement rates. Herr Hauptmann called his driver, Gefreiter Werner Schultz, climbing up from the engine deck. The transmission is overheating again. We need to shut down for at least 2 hours. Vogel nodded wearily. How many kilometers this time? 43, Herr Hauptmann. 43 kilometers. The Panther's transmission, its Achilles heel, was rated for 150 kilometers between maintenance. In practice, they rarely made it past 50. The final drives, those precision-manufactured bearings Becker had mentioned, couldn't handle the tank's 45-ton weight combined with the massive torque from the Maybach engine. They overheated, stripped gears, and failed with predictable regularity. Vogel looked across the staging area where his company had assembled. Panther 212 sat with its engine deck open. Mechanics working by lamplight to replace a failed fuel pump, a 16-hour job requiring parts that wouldn't arrive for 3 days. Panther 224 had thrown a track that morning. The manganese steel links were so hard that welding them required specialized equipment only available at depot-level maintenance. 30 kilometers behind the lines, Panther 235's gun hydraulics had failed, leaving it with manual traverse only usable, but sluggish enough to be a death sentence in combat. Meanwhile, across the Vistula, Soviet forces were massing, and they weren't bringing Tu-34s anymore. They were bringing American Shermans, shipped through Lend-Lease by the thousands, arriving at Murmansk and rolling west on their own tracks because, unlike Panthers, they could reliably drive 500 kilometers without major mechanical failure. Vogel had seen them 2 days ago through his binoculars. A column of at least 40 Shermans, marked with red stars, moving along the river road. They weren't impressive machines. Their armor was thin enough that his Panther's 75mm KBUK-42 could punch through them at ranges where they couldn't even see him, let alone shoot back. But there were 40 of them, and they were all moving, all operational, all ready for combat. How many Panthers could Germany field across the entire Eastern Front? Perhaps 400? Vogel thought. Maybe 500 on a good day, if you counted the ones stuck in repair shops waiting for parts. How many Shermans could the Americans produce in a month? Becker's report had said 2,000. The mathematics was obscene. Herr Hauptmann, said Oberfeldwebel Kurt Richter, his gunner, joining him in the turret. Permission to speak freely. Granted. The men are asking questions about why we're falling back, about why we don't have fuel, why we don't have spare parts, why half our tanks are deadline for maintenance. Richter paused. They're asking if we can actually win this war. Vogel was silent for a long moment. In June 1943 at Kursk, his Panther company had destroyed 37 Soviet tanks in a single engagement. They'd felt invincible. The Panther was faster than a T-34, better armored. With a gun that could kill at ranges Soviet tankers couldn't dream of. They'd torn through Soviet formations like a scythe through wheat. But 37 kills had cost them 9 Panthers. Not to enemy fire to breakdowns. Transmissions seizing in the Russian dust. Final drives shattering under stress. Engines overheating in the summer sun. By the time they'd withdrawn from Kursk, only 11 of his original 22 Panthers remained operational. The Soviets had lost hundreds of tanks, but they'd had thousands more. Germany had lost 43 Panthers across the entire offensive. And there were only 200 replacement Panthers in the entire Wehrmacht inventory. I read a report, Vogel said quietly, from an engineer who examined a captured Sherman. Do you know what he concluded? No, Herr Hauptmann. He concluded that the Americans designed their tank to lose. They made it simple, crude, easy to build, and easy to replace. They made it so that factory workers who'd never built a tank before could produce one in a week. They made it so that a crew could abandon it, and another crew could claim it the next day. He looked at Richter. We designed our tanks to win. The best armor, the best guns, the best optics. Every Panther is a masterpiece of German engineering. Then why are we losing? Herr Hauptmann. Vogel gestured at the disabled Panthers around them. Because you can't replace a masterpiece. You can't build a masterpiece with unskilled labor in a converted automobile factory. You can't repair a masterpiece in a field workshop with hand tools. Every Panther we lose takes 55,000 man-hours to replace if the factory hasn't been bombed. If the suppliers haven't been destroyed. If the trains can still move parts across a shrinking Reich being strangled by Allied air power. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it with shaking hands. The Americans lose 5 Shermans for every Panther we destroy. But they built 30 Shermans in the time it took us to build 1 Panther. And when those 5 Shermans die, the crews bail out and get 5 new Shermans the next day. When our Panther dies, we get nothing, because there's nothing to give us. Richter stared at him. So we've already lost? We lost when we decided to build the perfect tank instead of the adequate tank, Vogel said. The Soviets understand this. Their T-34 is crude, uncomfortable, barely has any optics worth mentioning. But they can build 5,000 of them in the time it takes us to build 500 Panthers. The Americans understand it even better. Their Sherman is worse than our Panther in every way that matters in combat. But they can build them faster than we can count them. Across the staging area, Panther 212's engine roared to life, then coughed and died. The mechanics shouted in frustration. Vogel took a long drag on his cigarette and watched the smoke drift away on the evening breeze. In 1,941 inches, he said, we invaded Russia with 3,000 tanks. They were Panzer IIIs and IVs not as good as what we have now, but reliable, mass-produced, available. We reached Moscow's suburbs. Now we have Panthers and Tigers, the finest tanks ever built, and we're defending the Vistula River, 200 kilometers from Berlin. He flicked the cigarette away. Tell the men the truth, Richter. We can win every battle. We just can't win enough of them. Kummersdorf Testing Facility, February 3rd, 1945. Klaus Becker sat alone in Bay 3, the same bay where he'd presented his findings 6 months earlier. The captured Sherman was still there, though now it shared space with a Soviet T-34-85 and a British Cromwell. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery had become a constant companion. The Red Army was less than 100 kilometers away, pushing toward the Oder River. Berlin's days were numbered. The report lay on the workbench before him, stamped with red ink rejected. His proposal to simplify German tank production, to create a Volkspanzer, a people's tank that could be mass-produced in decentralized factories. had been dismissed by the High Command as defeatist. Instead, they doubled down on complexity. The Tiger II, the Jagdger, the Mouse, each one more powerful, more impressive, and more impossible to produce in meaningful numbers than the last. The door opened. Oberst Muller entered, looking 20 years older than he had in July. "Still here, Becker." "Where else would I go, Herr Oberst?" Muller walked to the Sherman, ran his hand along its scarred hull. "I've been reading the production reports. Last month, we completed 108 Panthers, 34 Tigers, 12 King Tigers." He laughed bitterly. The Americans produced 2,300 Shermans in the same period. The Soviets added another 900 T-34s. Between them, they outproduced us 30-1. "I know, Herr Oberst." "Do you know what Speer told me last week? He said we have the finest armored vehicles in the world, but we're losing because our enemies have more trucks." Muller shook his head. "Trucks? Not tanks, trucks. The Americans have 250,000 trucks, maybe 300,000. They can move supplies, bring up fuel and ammunition, evacuate wounded, reposition entire divisions faster than we can react. Our mechanized divisions walk because we don't have fuel for the trucks we do have." Becker stood, walking to a map he'd pinned to the wall. It showed German-held territory marked in red, shrinking month by month like a dying star. "The Sherman isn't just a tank, Herr Oberst. It's part of a system. For every Sherman the Americans build, they build 5 trucks to supply it. They build fuel tankers, ammunition carriers, recovery vehicles, mobile workshops. When a Sherman breaks down, a maintenance company arrives within hours with spare parts, new tracks, replacement engines. They swap the engine in 3 hours, and the tank is back in action." He pointed to another section of the map. "When a Panther breaks down, it sits where it stopped until specialized recovery vehicles can reach it, if they can reach it. If it needs an engine replacement, that's a week-long job requiring a depot facility. If the depot doesn't have engines, the tank is abandoned and destroyed to prevent capture. I know all this. Becker, I read your report." "Then why did they reject the Volkspanzer proposal?" Muller was quiet for a moment. "Because accepting it would mean admitting we were wrong. Admitting that all our engineering genius, all our pursuit of the perfect tank, was a strategic mistake. The men who designed the Tiger, the Panther, they're heroes of the Reich. Their tanks are propaganda victories. Every newsreel shows a Tiger destroying 5 enemy tanks. What they don't show is that Tiger breaking down 50 kilometers later and being abandoned because there's no way to recover it." He walked to the Sherman, opened the hatch, and climbed inside. Becker joined him. The interior still smelled of old smoke and metal, but someone had cleaned it, documented every system, every component. "You know what's truly remarkable about this machine," Muller said, his voice echoing in the cramped space. "It's not remarkable. That's the point. Every part of it is mundane, ordinary. The engine is from an airplane. The transmission is from a truck. The gun is adequate. The armor is sufficient. Nothing about it is exceptional except its availability." He pointed to the fire suppression system. "They knew this tank would burn, so they designed it to burn safely. They knew crews would panic, so they made 5 escape hatches. They knew parts would break, so they made everything modular and replaceable. They designed this tank as if they were designing a rifle, something to be manufactured by the millions, issued to anyone who could be trained to use it, and replaced the moment it stopped working." Becker nodded. "While we designed our tanks like we were designing battleships, unique, powerful, irreplaceable." And now the battleship era is over, Muller said quietly. Just like the era of the master craftsman is over. Wars aren't won by quality anymore. Becker, they're won by logistics, by production capacity, by the ability to absorb losses and keep fighting. Sir, he climbed out of the Sherman. The Americans lose 60% of their tanks in combat. 60%. But they don't care, because they have replacement tanks, replacement crews, replacement everything. We lose 30% of our tanks, and we're crippled. Because every Panther that burns is a Panther that took 3 months to build and can't be replaced. Through the bay doors, Becker could see snow falling, covering the testing grounds in white. Somewhere out there, German tank crews were manning Panthers and Tigers, fighting delaying actions against an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1, 20-1. They would fight brilliantly, kill scores of enemy tanks, and eventually die or retreat because they'd run out of fuel, ammunition, or functioning vehicles. I spoke with Hauptmann Vogel last week, Becker said, before his company was sent to Hungary. He told me something I can't forget. He said that in 1941, they won battles by destroying the enemy. Now, in 1945, they win battles by surviving them. The objective isn't to kill enemy tanks anymore, it's to escape with your Panther intact. Because there won't be another one. Muller buttoned his coat against the cold. History will remember the Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger as the greatest tanks of the war. They'll remember our 88 mm guns, our armor, our kill ratios. They'll make films about our tank aces. He paused at the door. But history won't remember that we lost because we built masterpieces instead of tools. We lost because we valued perfection over pragmatism. We built tanks for parades and propaganda, while the Americans built tanks for war. After Muller left, Becker sat in the silence of the bay, looking at the 3 tanks before him, the German engineering marvel, the Soviet industrial juggernaut, and the American mass-produced weapon. 3 different philosophies, 3 different approaches to the same problem. Only one of them had won. He thought about the Sherman crews, those American boys from Detroit and Chicago and small towns he'd never heard of, climbing into their crude, simple tanks, knowing they'd probably die in them, but knowing also that their deaths would matter, because 10 more Shermans would take their place, and 10 more after that, until the weight of numbers crushed everything in their path. He thought about German crews, tankers who'd trained for months to master the complexity of the Panther, who could identify targets at 3 kilometers and kill them at 2, who understood their machines with the intimacy of craftsmen, but who sat broken down on roadsides, waiting for parts that would never come, watching enemy forces bypass them because there weren't enough Panthers to hold the line. The mathematics had been clear in July. They were even clearer now. Germany had built approximately 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. The Americans had built 50,000 Shermans. The Soviets had built 60,000 T-34s. Quality had never stood a chance against quantity of this magnitude. Becker pulled out his notebook and began writing, not a report this time, but a personal account, a record for whoever might find it. Years from now, when the war was a memory and the lessons had been forgotten. He wrote about the Sherman, about its crude simplicity and its terrible effectiveness. He wrote about the illusion of German technical superiority and how that illusion had cost them everything. The Sherman, he wrote, was not the best tank of World War II, but it was the right tank. It could be built by amateurs, crewed by conscripts, repaired in field conditions, and replaced within days of being destroyed. It won not through excellence, but through persistence. not through innovation, but through availability. He paused, then added one final line. We built weapons to win battles. They built weapons to win wars. In the end, that made all the difference. Outside, the artillery grew louder. The Red Army was coming, riding in thousands of T-34S and American-supplied Shermans, coming to finish what crude simple. Mass-produced tanks had started on the beaches of Normandy and the steppes of Russia, coming to prove that in modern war, good enough in unlimited quantities defeats perfect in limited numbers every single time.